The sky above Tarkus 3 was a cauldron of churning purple and black clouds, each gust of wind carrying the scent of scorched metal and sulfur. Lightning split the sky with searing cracks, illuminating the desolate expanse below, a wasteland of jagged stone and ash stretching endlessly in all directions. On a cracked plateau, a colossal form lay motionless, Zari, the last of her kind. Her emerald scales, once radiant and majestic, were dulled and marred by battle scars and caked grime. Massive wings, capable of blotting out suns, now sprawled limply across the ground, broken and useless. Each labored breath she took sent faint wisps of smoke curling from her nostrils, and her great chest heaved with the effort. The poison they had used on her was insidious, designed to sap strength, to extinguish the fire that made her dangerous. The coalition of 8 systems had deemed her a threat too great to ignore. She had destroyed one of their outposts in a blaze of fury, her fire incinerating metal and flesh alike. What the coalition didn't care to mention was that they had provoked her, first hunting her, cornering her, and stealing her youngling. To them, her rage was proof of her savagery. To her, it had been a desperate fight to protect her only kin. For that, they had subdued her with poisons and chains and left her here, to die on a world devoid of mercy. Zari's vision blurred, and she felt herself slipping toward darkness. The memory of her youngling's frightened cries rang in her ears, a cruel echo that refused to fade. This couldn't be the end, not like this, not without. Footsteps. The crunch of boots on brittle stone jolted her from the brink of unconsciousness. She barely managed to crack open one amber eye, her pupils narrowing to slits. The figure approaching was small, too small to be one of the armored soldiers who had captured her. He moved with cautious determination, his outline framed by crackling lightning. "Unbelievable," the man muttered, his voice rough but oddly soft. He stepped closer, revealing a gaunt face, weary eyes, and a mop of unkempt dark hair. His clothing was patched and frayed, more suited to a scavenger than a soldier. He stopped a few paces away, hands resting on his hips, and took in the sight of the dying dragon. "Whoever did this to you, they didn't hold back," he said, his voice low. There was no fear in his eyes, only a mix of sadness and simmering anger. He moved slowly, as if approaching a wounded predator. "You've got a lot of fight left in you, though. I can see it." Zari's muscles tensed instinctively, a faint growl rumbling from deep in her throat. It was a pitiful sound, nothing like the earth-shaking roars of old, but it was enough to give him pause. "Easy," the man said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm not here to hurt you. Name's Rayner. Just a very unlucky guy." It seems he knelt down, rummaging through a worn pack strapped to his back. When he stood again, he held a small, cylindrical device that glowed faintly. "This might sting a bit." Zari watched warily, too weak to move as he stepped closer. Rayner pressed a button on the device, and it emitted a soft hiss. He applied it to the jagged wound along her flank. Pain flared white-hot, and Zari let out a strangled cry, sparks flaring from her maw. But then, slowly, a soothing warmth spread through her veins. Whatever he had injected was pushing back the poison's grip, if only a little. Rayner worked quickly and quietly, tending to her wounds with a mix of primitive tools and scavenged tech. He wiped sweat from his brow, his hands trembling slightly. "This isn't much," he said, almost to himself. "But it's better than nothing. I don't suppose you can tell me if it's helping." Zari's only response was a ragged exhale, smoke curling weakly from her nostrils. She didn't understand his words, but his tone, so different from the harsh shouts and barked orders of the soldiers, was enough to hold her attention. Rayner moved with care, his touch hesitant yet deliberate. He siphoned small amounts of water into her mouth, applied a salve to her cracked scales, and even fashioned a makeshift brace for one of her wings. "Who did this to you?" he asked, eyes darkening. "The coalition, right? It always comes back to them." He paused, as if waiting for an answer. When none came, he sighed and sat back on his heels. "I'm no hero," he said quietly, "but I can't just leave you here." Zari's vision swam, exhaustion tugging at her once more. She wanted to snarl, to warn him away. She wanted to believe he was just another opportunist. But something in his gaze, steel tempered with empathy, made her hesitate. Against every instinct, she forced herself to shift, to lift her massive head an inch from the ground. It was a weak gesture, but Rayner's eyes lit up. "There you go," he said, his voice tight with hope. "You're not done yet. We're getting out of here." The journey to his ship was a test of endurance and will. Rayner scavenged debris to build crude sleds and leverage points, dragging Zari inch by agonizing inch. He stumbled, cursed, and nearly collapsed, but he never stopped. When the scorching winds of Tarkus 3 threatened to blind them, he shielded her eyes with his own body. When she faltered, he whispered words of encouragement she couldn't understand but felt all the same. By the time they reached his ship, a battered freighter with a dented hull and flickering lights, Rayner was barely standing. He opened the hatch and coaxed her inside, guiding her to a space that was far too small for a creature of her size. But she didn't care. The hum of the engines beneath her and the scent of metal and grease told her one thing: they were moving. Away from this place. Away from death. Rayner slumped against the wall, breathing hard. "I don't know what's ahead," he said, his voice a mix of exhaustion and determination. "But you're not alone. Not anymore." Zari closed her eyes, letting the vibrations of the ship soothe her aching body. She didn't understand the human's words. She didn't trust him. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt something more than pain. She felt hope. The Starstray groaned and shuddered as it climbed through Tarkus 3's turbulent atmosphere. Rayner guided the freighter with a mix of skill and raw determination, his hands flying over the controls as he tried to keep the barely functional ship from tearing itself apart. Zari lay curled in the cramped cargo hold, her massive body contorted to fit within the narrow confines. She could feel every jolt and lurch of the ship, each one sending fresh waves of pain through her battered form. Rayner's voice crackled over the intercom, distorted but unmistakably tired. "Hang on back there. We're almost through." Zari's eyes flicked open, the low light of the cargo hold casting her scales in a dull green glow. She shifted slightly, testing her weight against the metal floor. Pain flared along her flank, where Rayner had applied the strange healing device, but it was manageable. For the first time in what felt like ages, she wasn't entirely at the mercy of her injuries. As the ship broke free of the atmosphere and into the relative calm of space, Rayner emerged from the cockpit, his expression a mix of relief and worry. "Made it," he said, leaning heavily against the doorway. "Barely, but we made it." Zari's eyes followed him, unblinking. She didn't understand his words, but she could read the fatigue in his posture, the tension in his shoulders. The human was fragile, small, weak, and entirely outmatched by the forces that hunted her. And yet he had dragged her from the brink of death. Rayner stepped forward cautiously, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "I know you don't trust me," he said, as if she might answer. "Can't say I'd blame you, but I need you to know we're not out of danger yet." Zari's tail twitched, the metal floor beneath her claws creaking in protest. She didn't trust him, but she didn't have the strength to fight him either. For now, their fates were entwined. Rayner seemed to take her silence as permission to continue. He moved closer, carefully inspecting the makeshift brace on her wing. "Looks like it's holding," he murmured, adjusting a strap. "You're healing faster than I expected. Good. We'll need every advantage we can get." He stood back and studied her, his gaze flicking from her cracked scales to her exhausted eyes. "You don't understand a word I'm saying, do you?" he asked, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. "No matter, I'm used to talking to myself." Rayner moved to a nearby console and brought up a holographic display. An array of star charts, patrol routes, and red-flagged alerts hovered in the air, flickering in and out of focus. "The Coalition's going to come looking for you," he said, more to himself than to Zari. "They don't leave loose ends, and they definitely don't leave survivors." He traced a path across the display with his finger, pausing over a small, distant system. "This here an old mining station on the fringe of Coalition space. It's abandoned, but it has a dense magnetic field. We can hide there. Buy us some time." Zari tilted her head, the glow of the hologram reflecting in her eyes. She didn't understand the human's plans, but she could feel the urgency in his movements, the weight of whatever danger loomed ahead. Her instincts told her to flee, to find open skies where she could escape the clutches of her enemies. But the wounds that still ached in her bones reminded her that she wasn't ready. Not yet. Rayner turned back to her, his expression softening. "I know you're scared," he said quietly. "I am too. But I'm not letting them take you back. Not after what they did." Zari let out a low rumble, the closest thing she had to a response. The vibrations rattled the walls of the cargo hold, but Rayner didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed emboldened. He nodded once, as if sealing a pact, and turned back to the controls. The journey to the mining station was anything but smooth. Coalition patrols crisscrossed the system, their ships cutting through space with ruthless efficiency. Rayner's hands rarely left the controls, his eyes scanning every sensor readout, every blip that hinted at incoming danger. When a patrol passed uncomfortably close, he killed the engines and held his breath, fingers hovering over the power switch for their stealth systems. In the cargo hold, Zari paced restlessly. Her scales scraped against the metal walls, and her claws left deep gouges in the floor. She hated the confinement, hated the helplessness. Her kind were meant to soar, not crawl through dark corridors like wounded prey. She let out a frustrated roar, the sound vibrating through the ship. Rayner's voice crackled over the intercom a moment later. "I get it," he said, his tone strained. "You're not a fan of being cooped up. Neither am I." He didn't try to calm her further. Instead, he focused on navigating them to safety. Zari could sense the mounting tension, the way his movements became sharper, more precise. Whatever hunted them was closing in, and she could do nothing but wait. When they finally arrived at the mining station, the sight was both a relief and a grim reminder of their predicament. The station was a sprawling mass of rusted metal and forgotten technology, drifting in the shadow of a gas giant. It looked barely functional, a graveyard of old mining rigs and corroded conduits, but it would have to do. Rayner docked the ship with practiced ease, the metal clamps groaning in protest as they latched onto the station's hull. He powered down the engines and exhaled slowly, wiping sweat from his forehead. "All right," he said, more to himself than to Zari. "Time to regroup." The station's interior was cold and dark, its corridors lined with decades-old machinery that hummed weakly with residual energy. Rayner led Zari through the winding passages, a portable lamp casting flickering light ahead of them. She moved cautiously, every nerve on edge. Shadows danced across the walls, and the air smelled of rust and decay. Rayner stopped in a wide chamber, a control hub with consoles and displays long since abandoned. He set down his pack and began tinkering with the systems, coaxing faint lights to life. "It's not much," he said, glancing at Zari, "but it's better than being out there." Zari didn't respond. She prowled the edges of the chamber, her claws clicking against metal. The space was slightly more open than the cargo hold, but it still felt too small. Too confining. Her gaze fell on Rayner, who was hunched over a panel, muttering to himself as he worked. She couldn't understand him, but she could see the exhaustion in his every movement, the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of keeping them alive. She lay down, her body coiled but her eyes never leaving him. Rayner noticed and paused, meeting her gaze. "You know," he said, a tired smile tugging at his lips, "this would be a lot easier if you could talk. Or at least tell me I'm not completely screwing this up." Zari blinked slowly, her tail twitching once. Rayner let out a soft laugh, the sound echoing through the empty chamber. "Yeah," he said, turning back to the controls. "Didn't think so." Time passed slowly on the station. Rayner scoured its depths for anything they could use: scraps of metal, leftover rations, ancient tech that still held a spark of life. Zari prowled and rested in equal measure, her body slowly mending. The station became their temporary refuge, a place where they could catch their breath and prepare for what came next. But respite was fleeting. One day, as Rayner worked on repairing a power conduit, the faint crackle of a transmission echoed through the station's speakers. His blood went cold. It was a coalition signal, distorted but unmistakable. They were searching, closing in. Rayner raced to the main console, his fingers flying over the keys. "Damn it," he muttered. "They're already scanning this sector." Zari rose to her feet, sensing the change in his demeanor. Her scales bristled, and smoke curled from her nostrils. She didn't know what was happening, but she could feel the threat, the danger that had followed them even here. Rayner glanced at her, his jaw clenched. "We can't stay," he said, his voice tight. "We have to move." He didn't wait for a response. He gathered what supplies he could carry and motioned for Zari to follow. She hesitated, her gaze sweeping the chamber one last time. This place had been a brief sanctuary, but it was clear that peace was a luxury they couldn't afford. With a low growl, she moved after him. As they made their way back to the ship, Rayner spoke, more to fill the silence than anything else. "I don't know where we'll go," he admitted, "but I'll be damned if I let them take you again." Zari's eyes glimmered with something that might have been understanding, or perhaps it was just the reflection of the station's flickering lights. Either way, they stepped back into the Starstray, ready to face whatever awaited them. Together. The Starstray broke free from the mining station's docking clamps with a groan, engine sputtering before roaring to life. Rayner's hands were a blur over the controls, his eyes fixed on the holo display that showed incoming Coalition patrol ships. They were closing in fast, their formations precise and unyielding, a hunter's snare meant to crush any hope of escape. "Okay," Rayner muttered under his breath, sweat beading on his forehead. Think. In the cargo hold, Zari shifted uneasily. Her senses were attuned to the rising tension, every vibration of the ship's hull telegraphing danger. The space felt smaller than ever, suffocating. She let out a low growl, the sound reverberating through the hold like distant thunder. Rayner heard it through the comms and grimaced. "Yeah, I hear you," he said, as if she could understand. "This isn't looking great." He punched a series of commands into the console, rerouting power to the shields and bringing up the Starstray's meager arsenal of weapons. The freighter wasn't built for combat, it was barely built to fly, but he wasn't about to go down without a fight. As the Coalition ships drew closer, Rayner took a sharp breath. "All right, big girl," he said, his voice tight. "Time to see if bad ideas are really our specialty." He yanked hard on the controls, sending the ship into a steep dive toward a dense asteroid field nearby. The Coalition ships hesitated only for a moment before pursuing, their sleek frames cutting through the void like knives. Rayner gritted his teeth and guided the Starstray deeper into the chaotic maze of rock and debris, weaving through narrow gaps and spiraling around jagged outcrops. In the cargo hold, Zari braced herself, claws digging into the metal floor. She had no understanding of piloting or space battles, but she could sense Rayner's desperation. Every wild turn and bone-rattling impact against smaller rocks told her that they were trapped, hunted. A particularly violent lurch sent her crashing against the wall, and she roared in frustration. Her scales scraped metal, sparks flying. She was helpless here, confined to a box while her enemies closed in. The thought ignited something deep within her, a spark of the fury that had once burned armies to ash. But the fury was hollow without action, a flame without air. In the cockpit, Rayner was barely holding it together. The ship's proximity alarms screamed in his ears, warning of incoming fire. A plasma bolt grazed their shields, sending a jolt through the entire vessel. "Come on," he shouted at the unresponsive controls, as if sheer willpower could make the Starstray faster, more agile. "Don't quit on me now." Another bolt streaked past, and Rayner's eyes darted to the power readouts. The shields were failing. He needed a miracle. "Wait," he breathed, his eyes lighting up with a mix of desperation and inspiration. The core. Rayner's hands moved quickly, overriding safety protocols and diverting power from non-essential systems. In the cargo hold, Zari felt the sudden shift in energy, a deep hum that resonated through her bones. Rayner's voice crackled over the ship's speakers. "Zari, I hope you're ready to breathe fire." She didn't understand his words, but she felt the surge of energy as Rayner activated the ship's auxiliary thrusters, flooding the hull with a burst of heat and kinetic force. It was a reckless move, designed to destabilize the nearby asteroids and create a temporary barrier of debris. Rocks spun wildly, colliding with the pursuing Coalition ships and forcing them to break formation. Rayner pushed the Starstray through the chaos, sweat pouring down his face. Almost there, he whispered, his hands trembling on the controls. He caught a glimpse of a narrow gap between two colossal asteroids, a passage just wide enough for the freighter. He steered toward it, teeth gritted against the strain. The Coalition ships hesitated, unwilling to risk the tight maneuver. Rayner didn't hesitate. He drove the Starstray forward, scraping the edges of the asteroid walls as he squeezed through. Sparks flew, metal groaned, but they emerged on the other side alone. Rayner exhaled shakily, slumping back in his seat. We made it. He didn't have time to celebrate. The ship's systems were flashing red overheating engines, failing shields, and a half-melted reactor core. He needed to cool the ship down before it tore itself apart. In the cargo hold, Zari was on her feet, pacing restlessly. She felt the ship's distress, the way it groaned and shuddered like a living thing in pain. Rayner's voice crackled over the speakers again. "I need time to fix this. Just hold on." Zari growled, the heat in her chest building. She didn't know what the human was doing, but she understood the urgency. Her instincts screamed at her to break free, to find open skies. But there was nowhere to go, no way to help. Rayner stumbled into the hold a few minutes later, tools clutched tightly in his hands. His eyes met hers, and for a moment there was nothing but raw exhaustion between them. "It's bad," he said, voice shaking. "But it's not over." "Yeah." He moved to the exposed conduits, his hands working frantically. Sparks flew as he rerouted power and sealed breaches. Zari watched him, the heat in her chest simmering. She couldn't understand his words, but she could see the way his fingers bled, the way his shoulders trembled. He was pushing himself past the breaking point for her. A low rumble built in her throat, a sound that was neither threat nor warning. It was acknowledgement. The human was fragile, foolish, and entirely out of his depth, but he was fighting. Minutes passed like hours. Rayner's hands were blistered, his vision blurred, but he finally stabilized the core. The ship's hum evened out, the worst of the alarms silenced. He sank to the floor, breathing hard. "That should hold us," he said, more to himself than to her. "For now." Zari stepped closer, her massive form casting a shadow over him. Rayner looked up, meeting her gaze. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other, beast and man, predator and prey. Then slowly Zari lowered her head. Her breath warmed his face, and for the first time, he didn't flinch. "Yeah," Rayner whispered, exhaustion in every syllable. "We'll keep fighting." The bond between them was fragile, born of necessity and shared peril, but it was real. And as the ship drifted into the quiet expanse of space, both knew that the battle was far from over. Together they would face whatever came next, human and dragon, bound by the unspoken promise to survive. In the quiet aftermath of their escape, the Starstray drifted through the void, cloaked in the cold silence of space. Rayner worked tirelessly to stabilize the ship's systems, his hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. Every flicker of a damaged panel or sputter from the freighter's core reminded him how close they had come to destruction, but for now they were safe. In the cargo hold, Zari lay beside her youngling, her massive form wrapped protectively around the smaller dragon. The youngling's emerald scales, dulled from captivity and fear, were beginning to regain their sheen. It nuzzled into its mother's side, seeking warmth and reassurance. Zari's eyes, once fierce and unyielding, softened as she looked down at her child. She gently brushed her snout against its head, a low rumble vibrating through her chest, a promise that she would protect it no matter the cost. Rayner entered the hold, his footsteps hesitant. He carried a tray of raw meat, salvaged from their dwindling supplies. He approached slowly, careful not to intrude on the fragile moment between mother and child. "Brought you something," he said, his voice tired but gentle. "Not the best, but it's all I've got." Zari's eyes flicked to him, and for a tense moment there was no sound but the hum of the ship. Then she inclined her head ever so slightly. Rayner took that as permission and placed the tray within reach. He stepped back, watching as Zari sniffed the meat cautiously before taking it. She tore off a piece and nudged it toward her youngling, who ate hungrily. Rayner felt a pang of relief. They were recovering slowly, but they were recovering. He sank to the floor, resting his back against a bulkhead. "You did good back there," he said, addressing Zari even though he knew she couldn't understand. "I'm not sure how we made it out, but we did." Zari's gaze lingered on him. She didn't grasp the meaning of his words, but she recognized the tone, respect, perhaps even gratitude. It was a strange thing, coming from a creature so small and fragile. Her kind had always been feared and hunted. Humans and their ilk saw dragons as beasts, monsters to be slain or tamed. But this Rayner, was different. The moment was interrupted by the blare of an alarm. Rayner's heart sank. He pushed himself to his feet, stumbling back to the cockpit. "What now?" he muttered, fear tightening his chest. The sensors displayed a new threat, another coalition patrol, larger and more heavily armed than the last. They had found them again. Rayner's hands flew over the controls, activating whatever defenses he could muster. "This isn't good," he whispered. Not good at all. The freighter was still damaged, their power reserves depleted. There was no way they could outrun or outfight another encounter. In the cargo hold, Zari felt the ship's vibrations change the rhythm of danger and battle. Her muscles tensed, and her eyes blazed with renewed fury. She would not let them take her youngling again. Not while she still had breath. Rising to her full height, she let out a deafening roar that shook the walls. Sparks danced along her scales, and the faint glow of flame flickered in her throat. Rayner's voice crackled over the ship's comms. "Zari, I know you're ready to fight, but this time we need more than raw strength." He knew that brute force alone wouldn't save them. They needed to plan a desperate gamble that might give them a chance. His mind raced, searching for anything that could turn the tide. The mining station's debris field was still nearby, a graveyard of metal and forgotten technology. An idea sparked, a reckless, terrible idea. Rayner opened a comm channel to the hold, even knowing she couldn't understand. "I'm going to lure them in. Use the debris field as cover. It's going to be rough. Just trust me." He steered the Starstray toward the field, the coalition ships closing fast. Energy blasts streaked past, grazing their shields and rocking the freighter. Zari's eyes burned with fury as she felt the impact. She braced herself, wings unfurling as far as the cramped space allowed. Her youngling pressed close, trembling but ready to follow wherever she led. Rayner guided the freighter into the dense cluster of wreckage, weaving through shattered hulls and twisted beams. The coalition ships pursued, their weapons tearing through the debris. Rayner activated a series of decoy drones, each one emitting false energy signatures. The drones scattered, drawing some of the enemy fire away. "Come on," Rayner whispered, sweat dripping from his brow. "Just a little closer." When the coalition ships pressed deeper into the field, Rayner triggered a sequence he had hastily rigged together, a detonation of magnetic mines buried in the debris. The explosion sent shockwaves rippling through the field, metal fragments slicing through space. 2 of the coalition ships were caught in the blast, their hulls torn apart. But more remained, relentless in their pursuit. Rayner knew they wouldn't last, not unless. In the cargo hold, Zari's instincts surged to the forefront. She understood nothing of Rayner's plan, but she knew the time for hesitation was over. She let out another roar, the heat building in her chest until it threatened to consume her. Flames licked at her teeth, and with a final, desperate push, she unleashed a torrent of fire unlike anything she had managed since her capture. It was raw, wild, and untamed, a searing beam of green flame that pierced through the cargo hold's viewport and out into the void. The fire struck one of the pursuing ships, melting its armor and igniting its core. It exploded in a brilliant flash, scattering debris. The remaining ships hesitated, their advance faltering. Rayner seized the moment. He pushed the Starstray's engines to their limits, breaking free of the debris field and accelerating away. The coalition ships, disoriented and damaged, fell behind. When the freighter finally slipped into the safety of a hidden hyperspace lane, Rayner collapsed back in his seat, tears streaming down his face. We did it." In the hold, Zari slumped to the floor, her body spent. The fire had taken everything she had left, but it had been enough. Her youngling curled against her, and for the first time since their capture, she felt hope, fragile but real. Rayner limped into the hold, every movement a reminder of their narrow escape. He met Zari's gaze, his eyes filled with exhaustion and relief. "You did it," he whispered. "We did it." Zari couldn't understand his words, but she could feel the weight behind them. She dipped her head, a silent acknowledgement of their bond. They had survived together. The freighter drifted through the stars, carrying 3 survivors bound by fire, blood, and a fragile trust. The galaxy would hunt them, the battles would continue, but they would face it all. Those together.